Greetings to everyone. I'm Hudson Nandi Lubinga from Uganda. I welcome you to this series of open source software. I'm going to be taking you through several presentations, and in the end you'll get to know better about open source software. This is our first very presentation. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and please invite your friends to also come and get this opportunity to watch and study open source software. In this first tutorial, we're gonna look at the introduction. We are going to look at the freedom and open source, definition of open source principles, benefits of FOSS, and then the shortcomings of FOSS. Freedom and open source. Now, open source software, just like any other software or just like any product in this world, they also have licenses. Now, these licenses in open source promise everyone, they promise the community that they give them what we call the software freedom. This terminology, freedom, is emotionally satisfying, and it is proving to be confusing, very confusing. When we talk about freedom in software, what do we mean? We have a foundation called the Free Software Foundation. It lists the 4 essential kinds of software freedom. So when we talk about freedom in software, or simply software freedom, these 4 essential kinds of freedom do apply. 1, we have the freedom to run the software for any purpose, the freedom to study how the software works and to adapt it to your needs, the freedom to redistribute copies of the software, and the freedom to improve the software and distribute your improvements to the public. So 1, you have that freedom to run your software, to run it on your PC for any purpose you desire, whether you want to sell it, whether you want to give it freely, depending on the license of the software. Then we are saying you also have the freedom to study how the software works, and after studying that software and how it works, then you can change and modify it so that it can adapt or it can suit your needs. You have the freedom to redistribute copies of the software. After acquiring the copy of the software, you are free to distribute it to any person that you desire. And then lastly, you have that freedom to improve on that software so that after improvement, you can distribute it to the public or to any person that you want. What about open source? So we have seen what we mean by freedom in software freedom. All those 4 kinds of freedoms that you have seen do apply. But now what about the open source? What is open source? What does this mean? This term is also confusing. This term open source was invented in 1998 by the Open Source Initiative, the OSI organization. And this organization coined this term to make the movement more business friendly than the already established free software. So the free software movement existed before the open source movement. But now when the open source came in through the OSI organization, they wanted to make the business more, the movement more business friendly. The existing movement, that is the free software movement, to be more business friendly. So what do we mean? Open source simply means that the source code of the program, the source code of your software, is included in the package that is distributed So when you are given a program or a software, in its package, even the source code is included. So when you get this source code, you can make changes to your program. So the difference between the open source and the commercial software is that you get the built product with the source code included. Whereas for the commercial software, only the creator of such the product can make changes. So it's only the creator who has the source code. But for open source, you distribute the source code as part of the package. So that's the difference. And when we mean open source, that means the source code of the program is open. In other words, every person can see it. You can distribute your source code. So that's the difference between open source and commercial software. And we have also tackled free software with the 4 freedoms that we have seen. Now, if you're not familiar with the process of how the computer program works or is created, let's go through this quick overview. A computer program can be created in 2 phases. We have the first phase when the program, that is the person who writes the computer program, is coding. And that person will use any preferred language. In the modern world, we normally use the high-level languages like Java, Python, VB.NET, C, C#, C++, among others. So when you are a programmer and you are writing the software programs, what you are doing is coding. And when you are coding, that code that you write using your preferred high-level language is what we call the source code. But now, this source code can be understood by you, the programmer, whereas computers only understand the computer language, which is in form of zeros and ones. That's the binary format, the machine language or the machine code. That's what computers do understand. So there must be a mechanism of changing that language to what the computers do understand. And that's what we call compiling. When you change the source code to a language, to zeros and ones, that the computer can understand. And decompiling is doing the opposite, when you are taking back to the source code from zeros and ones, but this may not be possible. So the open source software will give you the source code, but the commercial software is just the end product. You cannot take it back to the source code to make the modifications. So for the open source program, you get both the compiled program, which is functional, the software that is functional, and then also the source code that can help you, if you know how to program, to make changes and then compile and have another improvement in the product. We have this very common question: is open source software always free? Many people, when they hear the word open source, what comes into their mind is that they think it is free software. The word free and open source have almost become synonymous, but that's not accurate. They not necessarily mean the same. Yeah, of course, it's true. Most of the software released under the open source licenses are free available, but you will also find a lot of more software marketed, sold, yet they are open source. For example, we have the Red Hat. So it's not a must that it's not automatic that if the software is open source, then it is free, as in free in terms of cost. No. So all software released under the open source license is required to release the source code. So if you know how to compile your source code, the source code yourself, you can even build your own new version of the software, and you are free to sell it or release it. And this still will depend on the nature of the license the software was originally released as. We have another common question. Is open source software better than commercial software? In many instances, the open source software is better than commercial software, especially when the open source program is very popular. An example is the Apache web server, a very common web server, a very popular one. So in many instances, we are saying, yes, open source software is better than commercial software. We're saying in many instances, that means not at all times. Why? You may wonder why open source is often better than commercial software. Now, open source software basically has frequent version releases, and security patches are quicker when vulnerabilities are found. Now, many people contribute to the development of the open source software. They normally work in a community. We have programmers from different parts of the world, from different continents, that work in a community. They develop, they make sure that they do the testing. So they often make frequent version releases, like monthly. And whenever any vulnerability is found or any bug is found, the patches to fix those bugs are frequently released. So the quality of the open source program is higher as compared to the quality in the closed source or the commercial software. And in most cases, the quality is directly proportional to the popularity of the program. When it comes to open source software, the more popular the program or the software is, the more or the higher the quality. Many open source projects are abandoned. You should take note of that. So you should pay attention to how active the project is. So before you adopt any open source program for your business, make sure that you have done your research very well, and you know that it is popular, you know that people are still contributing to it, and so on. Otherwise, many projects are abandoned and they don't succeed maybe because of low motivation and because of unpopularity. Then we have another question. Is open source software cheaper? As you may think, before I even try to explain, the general answer is yes. Most open source software vendors will only charge you for their support, and in case of any new software release, they can even charge you for that. Whereas the commercial software vendors will charge you for the licenses as well. So, in my opinion, the open source software is generally cheaper. Much as that is true, to get the most out of the open source software, you must have what we call the in-house how-to talent. You must have that competence to analyze the code if you, for example, programmer the bearer, so that you yourself can do the modifications. You realize that companies spend a lot of money in consulting and supporting contracts implementing the open source software, and in the end it turns out not to be 100% successful. So if you have that attitude, they figure things out on your own attitude. If you can figure out things on your own, if you're a programmer, you can modify the program, you can study it. It will be a money-saving strategy for you. Otherwise, if you don't have that, the open source software can even become a nightmare for you, I tell you, my friend. And you may land onto a project that is no longer supported, that has no support from the community if you didn't do your research well. So it's better to adopt this strategy of open source when you have that attitude, when you have that capability of studying the software and maybe making the modifications. Now let's talk about the open source principles. These are the principles that any software considered open source must adhere to. Open source principles describe software that is open source. These guide us to the key things to look for in open source licenses, and the key things will find missing in the non-open source licenses. So these are the principles. The first principle is that licensees are free to use open source software for any purpose whatsoever. When we talk about licensees, these are the people who have acquired the license. The people who have acquired open source software licenses are the licensees, and the people who issue these licenses are the licensors. So here we are saying that the licensees, those who have acquired, who have gotten the product, the software, and they have the license, these people are free to use the open source software for any purpose whatsoever. So this means that the open source license may not interfere in any way with the use of the software by the licensees. You know very well that in the commercial software we have some restrictions on use, such as for research and for non-commercial purposes only. As you're installing your software, you know, most of you have a tendency of just clicking next as you're installing your software. But normally, as you're installing any software, there is what we call the license agreement. For us, in most cases, and this is not ideal, I don't recommend this. Most people just click, just tick, they check the box of I accept without even going through the license. But in those licenses, in most cases, you may acquire a software for only trial, for trial purposes, to try or to test, or for non-commercial purposes. Now, such restrictions that exist for commercial software may not exist for the open source software. And here we are saying that the phrase free to use is also intended to mean without any conditions that would impede use. Free to use without any conditions, it is free. That's what we mean, not free as in terms of cost, much as in most cases still the software is distributed free of charge, is acquired free of charge. Also note that the first word, licensees, means that the open source software is only available under the terms of a license to which the licensee must agree. So don't think that the open source software is just it can be free of charge, but there are licenses that the licensee must agree to. So they are available under the terms of the license that you should agree to, and then you use the software. Another principle, the second one, is that licensees are free to make copies of open source software and to distribute them without payment of royalties to a licensor. What does this mean? The licensor, okay, here we are, this doesn't mean that the licensor, the person or the company or any organization that issues the license, that it cannot sell the open source software. No, this merely means that the licensee needs not to pay the licensor for additional copies. He makes himself, even if those copies are distributed to others. So if you acquire the license, you may acquire it through buying the software. According to this principle, when you make the modifications, remember, it's mandatory for any distributor to also issue the source code. So if you have the source code, maybe you have, much as you have bought the software, if you make modifications, you are free now to distribute the software, the copies, free of charge. Yeah, you can distribute free of charge, or you can even still sell the copies. But what this principle implies is that the licensor should not charge more, should not charge you for the distribution of the new copies that you make. So as a practical matter, this open source principle drives the price of mere copies of open source software towards its marginal cost of production and distribution. Then principle number 3, we are saying that the licensees are free to create derivative works of open source software and to distribute them without payment of royalties to a licensor. So here we are simply meaning that if you acquire the license, you are free to derive more, to create derivative works out of your software program. You are free to modify it and come up with better products. And if you distribute them, you can distribute them without payment to the licensor. So under this principle, just like the intellectual property laws of the US state in their constitution, you are free to create derivative works from your product that you have acquired a license for. And from this principle, they aim at ensuring that quality software is built from the earlier softwares. So the advocates for free and open source software, they agree and contend that it's a requirement for any open source software licenses to permit the unhindered creation and distribution of derivative works. So this is essential to these free and open source software advocates. Okay, let's continue. Number 4, we are saying that the licensees are free to access and use the source code of open source software. So what does this mean? As you have already seen, one of the principles from principle number 3, that you have the freedom to create derivative works of the open source software. For this principle to be a practical reality, it means that the programmer who is gonna modify the program must have access to the source code. So the source code is not the means to an end, but the source code is a means to an end. You use the source code that is given as a means to the end, as a means for you to create the end product, but it's not necessarily the end itself. Okay, so we are saying that the phrase free to access Remember, we are saying according to this principle that licensees are free to access and use the source code of the open source software. So the phrase free to access merely requires the licensor to make source code available to licensees upon request at zero price, not necessarily to distribute the source code to everyone. So note this. Much as this principle is telling us that the licensees are free to access, it applies to the licensees. So if you have the license, the licensor should give you access to the source code, but not necessarily to any person who wants the code. This only applies to those who have the license to use the software. And number 5, we are saying that licensees are free to combine open source and other software. What does this mean? When you go buy the open source software and you put it on your machine, you are free to combine other software from other vendors, be it from commercial sources, on the same machine. So if you are free to share your computer memory with another vendor. So if you purchase your software, you can put another software on your storage. So you are free to choose which business and licensing model for software distribution you want. You are free to select from several alternatives, so restrictions and conditions are not imposed by the open source software licenses. And more so, as we noted in principle number 3, that you have the freedom, you are free to create derivative works from the software. This necessarily is not the same as combining software on media or on computers. So you are free to have as many other software from other vendors as you want on your computer, much as you have the open source software on it. Okay, having seen free software and we have seen the freedoms, the 4 freedoms, we have also seen the licenses, we have seen the principles that underlay the open source. Now we come to this term, free and open source, or what we simply call FOSS. Now the free and open source software, FOSS, is an umbrella term for software that is simultaneously considered both free software and open source software. Note, you can have software that is free but not open source, as you have seen the difference. But now free and open source is the umbrella term that combines both. In most cases now, the software that is available on market is both free and open. In other words, it is FOSS, it is free and open source. So this FOSS allows the user to inspect the source code and still provides a high level control of the software's functions compared to the software that is sold, the proprietary software. The term free software, as you have been noting, does not necessarily refer to monetary cost of the software at all, but rather it is whether the license maintains the software user's civil liberties. That is, when you talk about free software, you can give an example as freedom of speech, free in speech, free speech. Like in most countries, people do have the freedom of speech. You can speak as you want. You have that freedom to speak, but not in monetary terms, not as in free beer or free product or a free product, not that, but you can put it in that context of free speech. There are a number of related terms and abbreviations to refer to FOSS. We have F/OSS, still that means free and open source software. At times, instead of free, we use the term libre, and open source software. So we can also call it libre and open source software. At times, we abbreviate that as FLOSS or F/LOSS. The Free Software Foundation, the FSF, Free Software Foundation, uses FLOSS, free or libre open source software, as its preferred term. Now, in most cases, there is an overlap between the free software licenses and open software licenses. Much as that's true, there is a strong philosophical disagreement between the two advocates of these two positions. Hence, this terminology, FOSS, or free and open source software, was now created to be the neutral ground for these two philosophical disagreements, to be the neutral between FSF Foundation, that foundation, the Free Software Foundation, and the Open Source Initiative, the OSI. So this FOSS is a single unified term that could refer to both concepts. Let's talk about the benefits of FOSS. Remember now, FOSS combines free software and then the open source software. So what are the benefits? 1, personal control, customizability, and freedom. So the users of FOSS will benefit from the 4 essential freedoms that apply to the software freedom, or to the free software that we talked about. That is to make the unrestricted use of the software. You are free to start the software, to copy, to modify it, and to redistribute the software with modification or without modification. So the users of FOSS, of course, will have that personal control. They have the freedom to customize in the way that favors them. Then we have privacy and security. Now, the manufacturers of the proprietary software, or that is mostly the closed source software that is meant to be sold, their manufacturers, at times they are pressured to building in the back doors or other covert undesired features into their software. Now, instead of having to trust software vendors, the users of FOSS can inspect and verify the source code themselves and can put trust on a community of volunteers and users. So, with the free and open source software, you don't need to trust the software vendors, but rather you have a community of developers. Because it is a community, many developers, you can put your trust in those volunteers, and there are many people working together. So there are high chances to have security in the free and open source software. You know that the proprietary code is typically hidden from the public view. The vendors themselves and maybe a few hackers may be aware of the vulnerabilities in them, so they keep their codes a secret. But for the FOSS, since many people are involved, they can easily expose the bugs, and the bugs can be quickly fixed the moment they are exposed, because there are many developers working together. Another benefit is low costs or no costs, as you have already noted. In most cases, the software under FOSS are free of charge or at limited costs as compared to the proprietary software. And number 4, another benefit is quality collaboration and efficiency. So FOSS allows better collaboration among the parties and individuals whose goal is developing the most efficient software for the users, whereas the proprietary software is typically meant to generate profits. Their goal is, profits. But now for FOSS, they want to develop efficient software. It's a team of developers, many people, a community of developers. So more organizations and individuals will contribute to the projects as compared to the proprietary software, and therefore the end products developed under FOSS are technically superior. Okay, much as the FOSS has advantages, it also has some shortcomings or the drawbacks, and one of them is the security and the end user support. According to Linus law states that the more people who can see and test a set of code, the more likely any flaws will be caught and fixed quickly. Yeah, true that, but this doesn't guarantee a high level of participation. You may have a group of full-time professionals behind a commercial product, and this can be superior to the FOSS. So if you have full-time group of professionals who are paid and they are developing a commercial product, you may develop a superior product compared to FOSS. Remember, the public source code that you avail in the FOSS, still it is easier to be exposed to hackers and vulnerabilities. Hackers can exploit the vulnerabilities in it. But this is good to note. Such malicious hackers have to be more effective than the white hat hackers. These FOSS projects have what we call the white hat hackers, who have the expertise to disclose or to help fix the vulnerabilities. They expose the vulnerabilities, and now they bring the attention of the developers to fix those vulnerabilities. So these malicious hackers have to be more superior than the white hat hackers, which is not very common. But still, that's a shortcoming, a drawback of FOSS. Okay? Another drawback is that the hardware and software compatibility may be an issue. Some FOSS software are not compatible to the proprietary hardware, and these proprietary manufacturers for the hardware do it intentionally not to disclose the interfaces to the FOSS movements. And when they do that, the FOSS developers are not able to write drivers for the hardware. So you may find that you have your FOSS software, but it is not compatible to many hardware. That's another problem. Another problem, number 3, is that of bugs and the missing features. Yeah, while it is true that the FOSS software, the FOSS is superior as compared to proprietary software in terms of features, stability, and so on. Again, there are many cases where the FOSS has more unfixed bugs and missing features compared to the commercial software. In most cases, for the unpopular projects, the unpopular software, the commercial software may be better, and the FOSS software may have missing features, and bug fixes may not be implemented. In projects where motivation is low, remember, They depend on volunteers in many projects, depending on their motivation level, the time they have, and the skill to fix the bugs. So at times the FOSS software may have even more missing features, and bugs may not be fixed as quick as you may think. Another problem or shortcoming, number 4, we are saying less guarantees of development. There is often less certainty in FOSS projects gaining the required resources or participation for continued development than commercial software backed by companies. Yeah, as you may note, many FOSS projects do not succeed. And since these projects at times they are not profitable, large organizations can pull out of the project. So there is less guarantee of development and success in these projects. And number 5, missing applications. We have very many FOSS software, for example, the operating systems that lack applications. An example is the popular Linux distribution, the Linux operating system distributions. Some of them have a lower market share of the end users. Many end users normally want to use the commercial software like Microsoft as compared to the open source products. So in the end, since the end users are few, the applications available, the applications we are referring to, the application software, the software that are meant to fulfill a specific user task, are very few for some open source distributions. That's what we mean. Okay, my friend, this marks the end of our very first tutorial. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to invite your friends to also study. Remember that Jesus is the way.